Let's start our session. Good day, good afternoon, everybody. Today we are going to start a new chapter, new session. So already we are discussing about budgeting. We already started this chapter. That is public sector budgeting. We have already discussed this part, the process, the budget process, where we have discussed a definition of budget and a budget cycle and the characteristics of sound budget. So that sort of things we have discussed earlier. Now we look at perspectives and approaches. In this we focus here, the session topic is budget classification, presentation and programming. Here we look at a practical scenario. So how government of Sri Lanka classify and present and implement the budget. So we are going to take real examples. The perspective of budgeting, the views perspective here, they're mentioning the view of budget. A budget includes not only a time dimension. Some people argue that budget is the quantitative expression of expected revenues and expected expenditure for 1 year, for the next year. So this one kind of is one dimension, it's one kind of view, one perspective, but also different perspectives that is giving a different picture of the same thing rather than truly the same thing. So look at here, when we ask our students, they simply says it's a proposal for the next year, how the government is going to raise fund and government going to allocate the fund. So it's a budget. Politicians view in different way. So they see the budget as a political tool. The politician says government going to make the country, so the government is going to make foolish, or the government is proposing a new budget, new proposals to establish or to improve their influence, the power, so that kind of things. And different people view the budget in different lenses, using different lenses. So business people look at the budget in different manner. So the business people look at the budget, are there any ways to make money? Are there any investment opportunities for us? And foreigners, for potential foreign investors, look at the budget. Are the government give us any exemption on taxes, or the government encourages foreign investment, like that. So budget is a one document, a set of document, but the views are different. So budget include not only a time dimension but also different perspectives, that is giving a different picture of the same thing rather than truly the same thing. You know, when the budget speech going on in the parliament, different medias and different audience give a different opinion, because these opinions, the expression of opinions, are based on their view. Here there's perspective. So here we look at not the politician perspectives, not the businessman point of view, or not the foreign investors, or not the media's perspective. So our perspectives are different. Here there are many perspectives, but we focus on these three perspectives. Functional perspectives, function. So it's including product perspectives. Here products mean, so what are the product government produces? What are the products? Exactly what? So government give us education, it's a product. Health services, it's a product. Defense, product. Social security, it's a product. So these are the things. So when we can look the budget, how the government going to prioritize, whether the government prioritize for education or defense or health sector or investment sector, so agriculture sector. So this kind of things, functional perspective. The government organization have different functions. So that is one perspective. Budget by nature. So there are expenditures like salaries, wages, and income in the way of tax and foreign funding and capital expenditure, interest payment, loan payment. So those kind of things, how the government is allocate money. So this is budget by nature. And institutional perspective, so how the government is going to allocate money for particular institutions, how the government going to fund for the cement factory or the state pharmaceutical corporation or state trading corporation and sugar manufacturing corporation. So the institutional perspective, right? How much fund allocated for universities, how much fund allocated for research centers, how much fund allocated for schools. So it's a different perspective, right? Here the institutional perspective, nature perspective, and functional perspective. So these are the three. So if you want more information, you can take this book written by Entries and Bergam. So the title of the book is Public Sector Financial Management, page number 48 to 50. You can refer and you can get a clear idea on that, on these budget perspectives. But here our focus on expenditure classification rather than income sources. We are focusing on expenditure, how the government prepare budget based on expenditure classification. Right. Here different budget perspectives as mentioned above result public expenditure classified and analyzed in different dimensions. When dealing with public finance, you will often find and will have to have public expenditure classified, counted, reported, and analyzed in different categories. So what is the best way of classifying the public expenditure? So what is it? So we have here, so there are three perspectives: finance, functional perspective, budget by nature, or institutional perspective. So out of this, what is the best way of classifying expenditure when they are preparing budget? So the answer is it is depends on the purpose. Depends on the purpose. So it works as normative framework. So it's differ government to government. So we'll discuss in detail. So why? What are the importance of expenditure classification? Classifying expenditures is important for policy formulation and measuring the allocation of resources among sectors. So government, so different one government give priority for one sector over another government. So this government priorities for internal production, local production, but earlier government or another government, they may focus on another sector, industrial sector. So when they are making policies, they have to allocate money, they have to allocate funding, and they have to measure the performance, whether the government policy, the policy proposed by the government is work effectively, it's work fine. So the government wanted to measure themselves whether the policy works or not. For that, they want a proper classification, proper expenditure classifications, and ensure compliance with legislative authorities. In the parliament, they're preparing the budget in the parliament, they allocate they're allocating funding for different classification for different sectors. So they have to monitor at end of the year, they have to report on accounts of this public expenditure, to report the expenditure, and also the auditors, the audit general department will come and check the audit of the government document, government expenditure. So for that purposes, they want a proper classification of expenditure to ensure the particular institution or the particular government spend money according to the budget, according to their allocations, according to the provisions. So with the legislative authorities here, the COPA, and Audit General Department, Audit Services, like that. And also, the classifying expenditure is important for policy review. Once government propose new policies, and the government wanted to see the effectiveness of the policy. For that, they have to have proper classification of expenditure for policy review and performance analysis. And classification expenditure is important for day-to-day administration of the budget. Right? So for example, senior level employee, senior level executive. So how much they have to pay? So it is decided by the budget. So based on the budget, the institute paid for that employee. So it's easy for day-to-day administration. Or the particular institute wanted to construct a building. How much should be allocated? So how much money? So how big the building is? It's based on the fund allocated in the budget. So the budget make the administration easy. The purpose of classification of expenditure. Public expenditures may need to be classified in different ways for different purposes. Right? The public expenditure maybe need to be classified in different ways for different purposes. So here, when you normally we see when the budget, when they are disclosing summary, right? So we see that. So you can find budget highlights. Here agriculture, right? They have classified. See how they classified. Irrigation 50 million, livestock 3 billion, plantation 9 billion, agriculture here 55 billion, fisheries 6 billion, like that. This is what agriculture capital investment. So you can see in detail here the water for all, capturing over 40% runoff to sea. So the government wanted to reduce the amount of water mixed in the sea. So they have the government wanted to utilize more from the river water, right? Water. So they have some proposals, and you can find in the education smart nations, right? Smart nation global innovation hub. That is the policy. That is the government policy. Here the education, they have allocated 5 billion, establishment of fully fledged 1,000 national schools island-wide, and they have allocated 800 million for what? Provision of drinking water facilities for all schools, and also another 500 million to child-friendly primary schools, and 1,080 million upgrading all teachers training centers. So likewise, the government has allocated money. So this is what to find this kind of budget highlights, right? They want it, right? So we can find overview here, budget highlights 2021. So we can find for each ministry's budget highlights. So expenditure classification purpose. Public expenditure may need to be classified in different ways for different purposes, such as here first appropriation legislations. Appropriation, the fund allocation. Appropriation mean what? Fund allocation, legislation. So legislation means the budget speech, the budget presentation presented by the Minister of Finance. Now it will become an act once voted in the Parliament. For that they have to get approval from the Parliament. Here for the presentation of the budget to be for the presentation of the budget to the Parliament for enactment. So to get approval, so it's mean to the budget speech to become a powerful document to be considered as an act, they have to present in the Parliament. So without classification of expenditure, how can they present in the Parliament? Simply says we are going to collect this amount of money and we are going to spend this amount of money. For this ministry this much, this ministry this much. Is it enough? No. It is not enough. The finance minister of finance explain each and everything. It's a document, right? I will show you the budget document. And the second purpose of classification of expenditure, so budget administration and accounting. So when they implement the budget, so they are facing different issues. So if the government correctly classify the expenditure, it is easy. So for example, the government wanted to construct a new laboratory in a school. How much would be spent? It is already mentioned in the budget. So based on that scope, they are constructing the new laboratory, the new lab, or the new building, school building, or a building for university, a building for divisional secretariat, a building for post office. How much? Who decides? It's already decided in their parliament by the way of budget proposals. So budget administration and accounting, for the administration of budget implementation and budgetary accounting. And third, the policy making and review. So for the presentation of reports that match the need of report users, so policy decision makers, general public, budget managers, when the Minister of Finance speech present the budget, many people are concerned on the budget speech. For what? Everybody, the audience have different purposes. Here the policy makers, here IMF, World Bank, Human Rights Commissions, and UNHCR, right? So there are different agencies. We look at the budget. So what is there? So when we look at the budget speech, budget document, so it can easily understand what is the government policy is. Whether government supporting for agriculture growth, or government supporting for industrial growth, or the government motivate for local production, or this kind of things we can observe. So policy making and review. So when the government allocate more money for a particular ministry or for a particular department, we can understand that the government policy is to promote that ministry or that kind of thing. So for that kind of purposes, the government should have proper expenditure classification. And international comparison. So we can compare how much our country spend for defense. For example, for defense, how much Sri Lanka spend, how much India spend, how much Malaysia spend, how much Bangladesh spend. So it's based on the GDP, right? So 2% of money will be spent for defense, and 2.5% for education. So this kind of things should be there. For that purposes, there should be a proper expenditure classification. The first one, appropriation of legislation, they have to take approval from the parliament, and the budget administration, right, and the policy making review, international comparison. For that purposes, government should have a proper classification of expenditure. Expenditure classification. Here, categories. What are the categories? Public expenditures are generally classified according to the following categories. Functional, based on the function. For historical analysis and policy analysis, function here. So function, it means what? Education is a function, government function, and healthcare function, defense, social security, and so that sort of things, their functions. So how much they have allocated. So I can show you the budget document. budget 2022. Right, budget speech. Right. And this is budget speech, no? Budget estimates here. Yes. Here it has 3 volumes, right? It has volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. So it's a big document. So you can find here budget estimates. So here this is volume 1, fiscal year 2022. Here estimates. So revenue estimates. So revenue classifications. Right? Here how they classify the revenue: tax revenue, non-tax revenue, provincial council revenue, and government. So here expenditure classifications: standard, object code, categories, object title, summary of expenditure by program, national level financing. Right. So these are the things you can find here. Limit of advance accounts. See how the government has allocated money for each department and ministries. Here the list of ministries, departments, provincial councils, other spending agencies. You can find here there's a head number. So yes, head number and the ministry or department. So the estimate on which pages. These are revenue estimates. No financing. Right, now let's see the expenditures. Special spending units. Here's summary, right? How many? 1 to 25 special spending units. Program. It's a program budget for His Excellency President. Operational activities. How much? 2020 how much? 21 how much? 22. So it's a project 23, 24. Here you can find there are this is summary for what? Excellency President summary. So in the President office, how much? Salaries and wages, overtime and holiday payment, allowances, for traveling, for supplies, for maintenance expenditure. So there are different categories. Again, capital expenditure. So this is what recurrent expenditure, capital expenditure. So in category, employee categories. Again here salaries, overtime, allowances. It has their own code, right? So you have to download the document and please study. You will have probably an assignment on that. Right. So categories, expenditure classification categories. So public expenditure are generally classified according to the following categories: functions, for historical analysis and policy analysis; organizations, for accountability and administrating the budget, organizing the budget; funding, for administrating the budget; and economic categories, so for statistical reporting and aggregate fiscal control; and line items, or sometimes we call it object, for compliance control and internal management. So you may study, you may have a lot of information in the forthcoming slides. The detail you can find. Program, right, for policy formulation and performance accountability. So here look at how the budget expenditure has been classified. So first, the expenditure based on the function. For example, United Nations classification of foreign classification of function of government, classification of COFC, classification of fund of government. I will check it later, right? Classification of government. Defense, right? The function. Defense is the function. Health is a function. Education is a function. So how much government allocated fund for defense? How much fund allocated for health? How much fund allocated for education? So these are the example, the function of the government. So what is the purpose of this classification? For historical analysis and policy analysis. If the government willing to spend more money on health, so it may, so here for example, in the previous year government was spent 2% of GDP. Now the government is going to upgrade the spending 5% of GDP. This means what? Government policy is to promote health services. Or earlier the government spent 5 million, 5% of GDP. Now the government wanted to spend only 1%. So what does it mean? The government is not ready to finance more on health sector. The government is not giving more preference for health sector. And organization, you can find organization here like Ministry of Health, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Education, UGC, right, and Parliament and BMICH. There are organizations. The how much funding allocated for hospital, how much fund allocated for health, Ministry of Health, how much fund allocated for Ministry of Defense. So Ministry of Health is an organization, Ministry of Defense is an organization. So how much money has been allocated for a particular organization? For what? The purpose of classifying expenditure based on organization is accountability and administrating the budget. Right? So if the government allocate a particular amount of money to construct a university, a building in the university, the government will allocate money to the Ministry of Education, and Ministry of Education will allocate the money for particular university. So for the administrative purpose, the government, the budget classify based on the organization. Fund, so where the fund is coming from? So it's coming from consolidated fund, or it's coming from loan, or it's coming from any grant. Grant mean what? For example, a head fund and IRQ fund and World Bank fund and USAID fund and European Union fund, Kuwait fund. So based on that, so based on the funding, so for example the government want to construct a new hospital in Polonnaruwa, for example. Who is fund that? Chinese fund. Chinese fund. Right? So classification based on the funding. Sometimes the government wanted to construct a building in a hospital. It's from treasury fund, consolidated fund. And economic categories. So government finance statistics. Government GFS, government finance statistics. So economic categories. So compensation of employees, subsidies, grant, interest. When you can access the macroeconomic detail from websites, so where you can find how much spent, how much government allocated money for compensation of employees, and how much government spent for as a subsidies, how much government spent as a grant, how much government allocated for payment of interest. So these are the economic categories. The government categorize the expenditure based on economic categories. For what? For statistical reporting and aggregate financial control, fiscal control. You may see the annual report of the central bank. Most probably you can find the information based on economic categories. And line items or object, personal expenditure, travel, maintenance. I saw one, here you can find here personal emolument, traveling expenditure, supplies, maintenance. Here personal expenditure, travel, maintenance, same thing you can find here. Personal expenditure, traveling, supplies, maintenance, services. So these are the categories. It's based on what? The line item. Here line item, object item, right? Category item, description. Here line item or object, personal expenditure, travel, maintenance. For the purpose? For compliance, control and internal management. Program, so development activities and operational activities. So for policy formulation and performance accountability. So these are the ways of categorizing of budget expenditures. Now we'll see, I'll check what is exactly COFG. Right, it's actually classification of the COFG, classification of the function of government, right? Function of government. COFG mean classification of the function of government, right? So earlier I may wrongly pronounced. COFG mean a classification of function of government. So recommends the functions to be reported in 10 divisions. So first one, general public services. So for example, here administration of so issuing birth certificate, issuing revenue license, issuing land register, issuing marriage certificate, and other things, right? So maintenance. So most of the time this kind of services offered in the DS office, divisional secretariat. and the DS expenditure for DS, GS, like that. So defense, so it's especially to protect our country from terrorists and from other enemy countries. So defense, how much government allocated money for defense. So defense expenditure is one kind of category. Public order and safety. Public order and safety. So this is normally is done by police. Public order and safety. Economic affairs. Ministry of Economic Development. Ministry of Economic Development and Ministry of Industries and Commerce. So that kind of affairs. BOI, Board of Investment, Export Development Board. So that kind of ministries will get the money from this. And environmental production, Environment Authority and Forest Department and natural resource production and coastal area production department. So that kind of thing. Environmental, how much government spend for environmental protection. Housing and community amenities, housing development NHD, National Housing Development Authority. So how much fund allocated for this purpose, and how much government allocated for health services, providing health services. It is how much amount allocated for construction of new hospital and improvement of existing hospital and establishment of new units, establishment of new medicine production system, medicine production facilities, factories, like that, for health. And the recreation, culture and religion. So Ministry of Buddha Sasana and Ministry of Culture, recreation, tourism, right? Tourism and museums. So that kind of allocations are coming here. So how much government allocated for education? So how much fund allocated for universities, amount allocated for VTA, vocational training authorities, technical colleges, schools, that sort of amount, right? And social production, so pension fund especially, and some kind of payment for to whom older people, whose age is more than 70 years, and the orphanage, for government will give some amount of payment for that. So these are the categories of expenditure based on the function. Now we'll see economic categories. An economic classification of expenditure is required for analyzing the budget and defining the macro policy positions. So macroeconomic policy, we can find here how much tax revenue, how much grant allocated, how much employment, how much interest payment, how much principal loan payment. So this kind of things you may find in their economic reports. For example, annual report of Central Bank of Sri Lanka and World Bank, IMF. So we can find the government expenditure. An economic classification of expenditure is required for analyzing the budget and defining macro fiscal policy positions. For example, the share of wages in the government expenditure, the value of transfer to public enterprise are important measures of the impact of policy. So in the budget speech, in the annual report, you may find what the portion allocated for salaries and wages, how much allocated for interest payment, how much allocated for settlement of loan, then balance how much allocated for other development expenditures. So this kind of indicators, it is based on economic categories classification. Here government financial statistics. So economic classification of government expenditure. Here based on GFS, economic categories. What are the expenditures categories? Compensation of employees, use of goods and services, consumption of fixed capital, interest, subsidies, grants, social benefit, and the expenses. So now please read government finance statistic for more detail of each of the above economic classes. Right, we have one chapter on government finance statistics. We will discuss in detail. And we look at the Sri Lanka budget. So we will. So it is a new thing, right? A new area in the session. We will discuss in detail in the next class. You hear? I'll give some overview. Right, the budget when government of Sri Lanka, Minister of Finance proposed budget, it consists of three parts. So general services and special law services and advanced account activities. So I'll show you the budget. You may find each and every divisional secretariat, district secretariat, allocated funds. Here, first schedule. First schedule indicates government expenditure on general services. How much? On million, billion, trillion. There are 2.7 trillion allocated for general services. For the second schedule, 2.6 trillion. Right, 2.6 trillion. Right. So indicate expenditure for government authorized law which are charged to be constitutional fund. And third schedule indicates the expenditure on advanced account activities. Here, advanced account. Here there are three schedules. Here you can find there are three schedules. First schedule of the Appropriation Act. So that is for what? General services. Second schedule of the Appropriation Act is for special law and services. Third schedule of the Act, advanced account activities. Okay. First schedule, second schedule, third schedule. We will discuss in detail in the next class. We will look at this budget document. In line with, we are going to compare the notes or slides with we are going to compare these kind of slides with the original budget, and then you may find detail. This is the structure of budget. Here, general services, special law services, advanced account activities. So each, here there are three headings. These are the three main headings. So the first heading, the general services. Again, there are different heads. So under each head there are two programs: operational activities and development activities. Again, each program consists of projects. There are number of projects. So one project consists of there are number of sub projects, and each sub project has object categories. So it has recurrent expenditure and capital expenditure, and again it has a different object. Salary, for example, salary. Here supply, maintenance, so like that. And each object has its items, item 1 to n number of items, and each item has source of funding, where the fund is coming from. This whether it's coming from public domestic finance or foreign finance. And in the domestic there are many sources of finance. So everything we will see in our actual budget 2022. So it's advisable to download the budget. It's available in the treasury website. Please download. You may have one assignment on that, on small presentation, individual presentation. I think every one of you should choose a different expenditure head. So you have to explain how the expenditure has been divided: programs, projects, sub projects,